Hi there, and welcome to the second edition of Pokemon, an entire month dedicated to talking about Pokemon because hey, they made a new game this year, and people have been talking about this franchise all year, so I might as well do the same. Pokemon has been a part of my life for as long as I can remember, and this feels like the best way I can give back to it. By talking about old controversies? Well, if you love something enough, then arguably you're well equipped to criticize the hell out of it and remind everyone that actually, Pokemon has made the news in the past for some slightly less flattering reasons. I suppose this is a natural occurrence for any franchise that explodes in popularity in a short space of time, that there's every chance of offending people or making mistakes or simply being so popular that people want to see Pokemon crash and burn. Hey, that's not such a bad name for the next Pokemon games. Not so sure how I'm ranking them yet, but let's just say that not every controversy is born equal. Quite a lot of them are really stupid and appeal to a section of society that's ruled by fear-mongering and the overriding feeling that everything Game Freak does is wrong and is deliberately malicious, but damn, they definitely make for interesting stories. Gather around, kids, and I'll tell you a tale of when Pokemon got weird and legally questionable. And also fucking wild sometimes. Whose content is made for kids now, bitch? I feel like the most natural place to start is with the most recent controversy, since it hasn't had enough time to fester and develop within the minds of those involved. Pokemon is a huge franchise at this point, and I think controversy is never too far away, but despite that, it did surprise me how exactly people decided that Sword and Shield weren't worth their time. Conceptually, these games should be must-haves for everyone, as main series Pokemon finally jumps onto home consoles with a new, more expansive style of catching Pokemon that combines so many features from previous games into one incredible adventure. But if you take away some of my Pokemon, then this is all dead to me. Bring me National Dex or bring me death. I had a lot of people asking me how I felt about Game Freak's decision to cut nearly 500 Pokemon out of the roster for their new game, and my overwhelming reaction was one of reluctant acceptance, I guess. Not that I wasn't upset, since my favourite is Salamence and he sure as shit isn't here, but Sword and Shield bumped the roster up towards 900 in total, and I always assumed that we'd eventually get to the point where this was too much for one game to handle. What annoyed a lot of people was Game Freak's reasoning, which explained that the roster was shaved down to allow for more focused development time on performance and graphical output, which many took issue with when some battle animations were a little lackluster. I get that, but have you seen some of the other ones? Confirmation bias is a hell of a drug. Apparently there was supposed to be a boycott on these games, but Sword and Shield sold 6 million copies over its launch weekend, which is a franchise record and a record for any Switch game, so it's not so much of an issue with most. Maybe put Salamence in Pokemon Gun though. Does anyone remember Uri Geller? Of course you don't, most people watching this video weren't born this century, and even then, most of you aren't British, so you likely weren't exposed to the legend of a man who can use magic, given to him by aliens apparently, according to him, to bend spoons. Wow. Yeah, clearly life was really interesting in the 70s and 80s, but Geller had a surprising return to public relevancy in the year 2000 when he decided to sue Nintendo to the tune of £60 million over his apparent likeness being replicated in the Pokemon Kadabra. They both use psychic powers to bend spoons, and Kadabra's Japanese name is a deliberate alteration of Uri Geller, so the evidence is pretty damning. Or maybe Geller just needed to cool it for a bit. You only have to go back through the Abra evolutionary line to see exactly what Game Freak and Nintendo were doing, and yes, they all seem to be homages to famous psychics and mystics, but curiously, only in the Japanese names. It could be that they decided for the Western audiences that playing off the magic words would be a more fun naming convention, or maybe they were up to something. Whichever way you swing it, Uri Geller is a man who still had a lot of money left over from his heyday by the time that Pokemon came crashing in at the turn of the millennium. When you've got a perceived breach of personal copyright and lots of money to throw at lawyers, I don't think it should come as a surprise to anyone to know that this dispute has never officially ended. 19 years is a long time to hold a grudge, but it's also a long time to deal with the fallout of a legal battle over copyright, which is why Kadabra hasn't had a new trading card made since 2003 and has barely featured in the anime since 2006. Despite this, Kadabra has of course appeared in every mainline Pokemon series after the year 2000, with Sword and Shield only recently breaking that streak. So evidently there's some kind of legal agreement in place where Kadabra can show up some of the time. Or Uri Geller is directly responsible for the removal of the national dex in Sword and Shield, and we should all be furious for some reason. Work on that one, conspiracy theorists. If we believed everything that we accidentally misinterpret, the world would be a wild place. You can't be around for as long as Pokemon, spending decades creating new creatures that reference so many different things without making a few mistakes that may reflect badly on the creative team and Pokemon in general. It goes without saying that no one involved with Pokemon is going out of their way to weave in Nazi imagery wherever possible, and I don't think anyone is saying that anyway, but it still doesn't look good. Maybe it says more for Game Freak's innocence or naivety than their secret passion for swastikas and goose-steppings, since there haven't been as many examples as there would surely be if this kind of stuff was deliberate. It all started in 1999 when the first run of Pokemon cards printed a Golbat card with a small emote Manji hiding in the corner, which has origins of peace and good luck in Eastern culture, but is also very similar to the swastika that we all know and see too often on the side of trains. A few years later, we had Team Rocket Grunts performing something a little too close to a Nazi salute, and once Diamond and Pearl came out, suddenly Reggie Steele was lifting his arm a little too high and doing the same. All of these were quickly amended and altered so that Pokemon could save as much face as possible, but it's enough for any conspirators to weave together a tapestry of Game Freak having sleeper Nazi agents that are trying to brainwash the kids of the world. So much so that we haven't had anything for 12 years. Maybe they're just lazy. Do you know who really hates Pokemon? Pokemon fans, seemingly, but now I'm talking about a deep-seated hatred for an innocent franchise that supposedly has the potential to teach kids the wrong message about how the world works. Christians, but too soon, we'll get to them later, don't worry. I'm actually talking about PETA, or the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, if you're somehow one of the 3 people who don't know what they do when they peek their slimy little heads out and say something stupid on the internet. Long story short on PETA, they're an organisation who say they're protecting animal rights but instead kill thousands of pets every year because they're better off dead than being owned by humans, I suppose. So clearly we should be listening to what these guys have to say about Pokemon. At this point, PETA are so absurd in their message that there's some entertainment value in seeing them try to convince the average person that they might have a point when Pokemon is the target. PETA has come after Pokemon numerous times in the past, most notably when they released a satirical flash game in 2012, a few months after Black and White 2 released, prompting the parody name of Pokemon Black and Blue, where you aim to free enslaved Pokemon from their abusive owners, with all the subtlety of a punch to the face. That's probably the worst thing that PETA has done with Pokemon, with only slight jabs here and there, and the re-promoting of this parody game coming shortly after Sword and Shield were announced earlier this year, but also they used a tweet that talked about Satoru Iwata's death to promote Pokemon Black and Blue, and I'd argue that's even worse. It must take a lot of dedication sticking to something like this even when everyone hates you. All of these controversies are terrible and paint Game Freak and Nintendo in a negative light, but how bad are they really? I mean, there were some court cases and some feelings were hurt, but, you know, there was no lasting damage and no one died, so how controversial are they really? Except someone actually died, and it's all Pokemon's fault. It was bound to happen eventually. Yeah, I can't think of a better way of celebrating everything that Pokemon is in 2019 than by highlighting the fact that it was indirectly responsible for the accidental death of 2 kids in 1999 because of some dangerous Pokeballs. Shortly after Pokemania had swept the Western world, Burger King struck up a crafty deal with Nintendo to give away 25 million Pokeball toys of every kid's meal, which is obviously a great idea since who wouldn't want a ball that opens up to reveal one of 57 different Pokemon? After all, gotta catch 'em all, so you better be scarfing those burgers down as fast as possible. Somewhat surprisingly, the deaths didn't come from kids force-feeding themselves greasy burgers, but actually suffocation due to the Pokeball itself. 13-month-old Kieran Murphy died just 1 month into the promotion after one half of the plastic ball formed an airtight seal over her mouth and nose. It took a near death just 10 days later before a recall was issued, with Burger King taking out TV spots to tell the world about their dangerous Pokeballs. And yet, in January 2000, there was another death. This time a 4-month-old baby who had also been suffocated by the Pokeball. Needless to say that Pokemon and fast food chains seriously reevaluated how they manufactured their cheap kids' toys, and thankfully we don't have to worry about hazardous giveaways anymore. The food though, well, that's a different story. It just wouldn't be a video about controversies involving Pokemon without mentioning Pokemon Go. Pokemon's reintegration to popular culture in 2016 was a glorious occasion that lit up an otherwise dreary summer with a renewed sense of enthusiasm for all things Pokemon, leading to millions of people taking the streets, getting exercise and exploring the world around them while capturing their favourite Pokemon. It was amazing to experience and something not even numerous glitches and broken servers could disrupt, and we can attribute Pokemon for curing worldwide obesity and saving the world. But then the news got involved and started doing some reporting, and all of a sudden, everything's surreal and terrible. Because for how great it is that Pokemon Go got people out of their houses and exploring their neighborhoods, it also got players going to places they otherwise wouldn't, some of which weren't exactly open to the public. It says a lot for what kind of grip Pokemon Go had over people that they were willing to trespass on private property and become oblivious to their surroundings, and shit, even I broke my thumb by walking into a lamppost. But then there's the more malicious side to all of this, like people finding dead bodies or becoming one themselves. There's a website now dedicated to tracking all of this, and when a free, hugely popular mobile game has claimed 19 lives in total, it becomes all the more serious a problem. Creators Niantic can't say they didn't see this coming, since their previous game Ingress killed a few people in similar incidents. Honestly, if you're dying because of a mobile app, I'd say you're worthy of a Darwin Award. And he had a thing or two to say about evolution. I stopped watching the Pokemon anime many years ago. Not because it isn't a good show, it definitely has been recently with the Sun and Moon reboot, but I suppose I had different things going on in my life at the time and fell behind on the series, and then I see how many episodes I'd have to catch up on, and I think what I could be doing instead, and yeah. But the Pokemon anime has been very entertaining when I was watching it, since it had free reign to give Pokemon significantly more personality than the games had at the time. If you think about it, the anime has probably made more content than the game, since we're 22 seasons deep and each episode is roughly 20 minutes long, so logically, there's bound to be some really dodgy shit in there. And hey, there definitely is. Not that we ever saw it for long. Again, I don't think there was ever any malice intended here, but there is a baffling lack of awareness over some of the choices made with the anime at times. It's a kid show at the end of the day, which means there are a few unwritten rules that you have to follow, and it's really simple stuff like, ooh, I don't know, maybe don't have an episode where everyone starts pointing a gun at Ash Ketchum for mild indiscretions, and even Ash is looking on like, what the fuck is going on with Pokemon right now? Plus, there's an episode where Team Rocket infiltrate a beauty contest and wear fake boobs and jiggle them around, and all I can think is, how did no one think that this might not be such a great idea? How unaware do you have to be to put something like this in a kid's show and be surprised when this episode takes 3 years to make it out of Japan, and even then, heavily edited? Damn Japan, you're too horny sometimes. Whenever any piece of culture makes the long journey across oceans and country borders, a lot of the intent is either lost in translation or lost in the myriad of cultural differences. To that end, it's impressive that Pokemon has assembled the empire that it has to this day, considering how different Japan is from most Western countries when it comes to societal norms and sensibilities. Perhaps it's no great shock that Pokemon has stoked a few fires, because it is a little weird when you think about it. Like Jinx, for example, what are you supposed to be? And why did Game Freak have to change your face? For those of you who are below a certain age cutoff, you might not remember a time when Jinx didn't have a purple face, and yet, if you search her up on Google Images, you will find a surprisingly high number of results where Jinx has a black face, acting as a reminder that once upon a time, before Game Freak woke up, Jinx did in fact have a black face. and that was never gonna last. The allegations of racism stem more from the angle taken with Jinx. There have been plenty of coloured characters in Pokemon games and in the anime, and yet the issue with Jinx was more one based on her being a negative depiction of racial stereotypes. Whether or not that was the original intention was obviously never made public, since it would end a few careers if this had any truth to it, but it's also never been stated what Jinx is officially based on. There's ties to Ganguru, which is where Japanese men heavily tan their faces and dye their hair a bright colour, which itself is derived from ancient Japanese folklore, so it's unlikely to be deliberately racist. And there's also Hel, the Nordic goddess who has a partially black face and ruled over an icy realm. Whatever the reason, the angry masses weren't listening, and so Game Freak were forced to colour Jinx with a purple face in all future appearances, while also discontinuing anime episodes where she appeared with a black face. Backtracking, yes, but very necessary. Otherwise we'd have documentaries called The Problem with Jinx. And we don't need that. Pokemon really does offend a lot of people, doesn't it? It's not like you've got angry mobs taking issue with Mario games or finding the latest Zelda game problematic, and yet you've got an innocuous series of video games starring adorable elemental creatures that you can grow into powerful monsters that can conquer any foe in your path. It's very rewarding, and I'm sure there's some life lessons in there about overcoming adversity and being kind to animals, and yet the takeaway for some is that all of this, every last morsel of Pokemon, is satanic. It's those dastardly Christians, isn't it? I told you we'd get back to them eventually. Specifically the extremist Christians, since I don't think the average Christian is struggling to sleep at night because they're fretting over the many ways in which Pokemon will one day corrupt their vulnerable child, but there's definitely a branch of Christianity, the sort that's convinced that God has a hate boner for the gays, that has had a vendetta against Pokemon ever since it first washed up on Western shores. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what it is that these people see in Pokemon that is so bad, but I think it's a combination of small things like the fact that Pokemon are able to evolve, something that does run counter to creationism, plus the existence of ghosts and a psychic type that loosely works like magic, so that's a big no-no, as well as a demonic dark type being attributed to some potentially satanic looking Pokemon like Houndoom. It's a wild theory that only serves to remind me that similar issues were had with Dungeons and Dragons years ago, and hey, that's pretty harmless too. What is this fun, and how can we stop kids from having it? It'd be interesting looking back over this video and wondering how many of these controversies were justified. I think if anyone is losing their life, then you have to sit up and take notice, since there's lawsuits to be had and reputations to be ruined. There's a million and one ways you can judge controversies, but I prefer to lean towards notoriety and how famously bad circumstances were when events unfolded. I'm sure there were many Japanese children who were very excited as they sat down at approximately 6:30 PM on the 16th of December 1997, eagerly anticipating another episode of the Pokemon anime. And hey, this one is starring Porygon, who is everyone's favorite, right? Not anymore, he isn't. Denoshensi Porygon, or Cyber Soldier Porygon, is the single most controversial thing that the Pokemon anime has ever done, and I'd argue the most drama that Pokemon has ever had to face. It's so notorious at this stage that I have no doubt that you've heard its story before, but that doesn't make it any less of a fascinating tale to tell. A fairly uneventful episode starring Porygon explodes into life around the 20-minute mark when Pikachu thunderbolts some missiles and the screen goes absolutely crazy. The resulting effect of flashing colours that I've slowed down for you is so intense that it caused 685 Japanese kids to suffer from a variety of epilepsy-related problems. Not everyone had an epileptic fit, but there were reports of nausea, convulsions, and even the loss of consciousness in some cases. I told you the anime was good when I watched it. Not that this episode ever made it out of Japan, of course, or was ever shown again. It was so bad and the reaction so severe that the anime was forced into a 4-month hiatus so that producers could comb through the rest of the already made episodes and remove any lighting effects that would cause similar reactions. There's clear intent here to make some kind of stylistic explosion effect, but it's baffling to me again that no one picked up on this during production. There are moments where the flashing is full screen and very rapid, and even though I don't have epilepsy, it still makes my head hurt a bit. Not as much of a headache as it was for Pokemon at the time, but they got by in the end. This is RabbidLuigi, and the weirdest little detail that often goes unsaid when talking about the Porygon episode is that the seizure scene itself only came about because of animation errors. That's probably why the series went on hiatus for so long, so they could look through future episodes and determine if this mistake had been replicated. Once they were back, they decided that Porygon and its evolutions could never ever appear in an anime episode ever again, even though it was actually Pikachu who caused the explosion that caused the seizures. He fucking paid them off, didn't he?